Let me tell you one way to break the heart of a Unitarian Universalist minister. It's by telling someone that the great part of being a Unitarian Universalist is that you could believe whatever you want. I like this head shaking, like, oh no, I would never do that to you. Of course, I think when we say that, or when we talk with celebration in our voice about this being a creedless faith, we're pointing to the great promise of religious freedom that Unitarian Universalism has always upheld. We are, and I like to celebrate and say that we are a non-confessional faith, that there is no set of beliefs that you have to sign your name to in order to belong to our church. There is no regular litany of theological tests that one has to recite. And I think that that freedom, the freedom to allow people to grow into their understanding, to find new truths, is one of the great promises of our faiths. And it allows us collectively to evolve in our own understanding of where truth lies. The reason why I so cringe at the fact that at the label that this is the church you could believe anything you want in is because it hides from us that there are certain wonderful promises embedded in our beliefs. And those promises lead us to a certain life of purpose. So I want to talk to you today about those promises and that purpose. We start with the promises. And I'm going to go back in history and talk about how these promises and this purpose played out in the life of a Unitarian minister pre-Civil War. There was a young man named Moncure Conway who was raised in a family of Virginia slaveholders. He went to a Methodist church where his family were upright and leading members of the congregation, and where in those hot Virginia nights he would hear his minister preach words of damnation that would so strike fear in the chords of parishioners that they would come literally on their knees to the altar. Those messages of damnation and fear would be intertwined with messages that talked about how the Bible upheld practices of slavery. In school, he was educated to take on the responsibilities as a slaveholder. As he grew into maturity, he began to hear this voice of conscience that began to say to him that the messages that he was hearing in church about damnation and slavery did not sit with the voice of his conscience. But he had always been taught that following the confessions of their faith was the path to follow, and questioning didn't have a role in his faith development. I imagine at that time this man felt very alone. So it happened one day, as sometimes it does, that he was reading this magazine, and as he was flipping through the pages, he found an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, Emerson himself didn't make it to Virginia that often in those days. And so young Conway heard for the first time that God might exist most of all in this world. And the voice of the conscience might be the voice of the Holy speaking to each one of us. Conway leaned into that with a new exuberance, like a path of salvation opening to him. And he began to talk to anyone he could find in Virginia who was interested in listening. I'm not sure quite how many people he found. And then he did the truly egregious thing in the eyes of his parents. He decided to go to Harvard to become a Unitarian minister. That did not go down well. Probably the best part of being trained at Harvard in the 1840s as a seminarian is that you didn't get to just read the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, you actually got to meet him. So early on in his career, young Conway walked the 26 or so miles to Concord, Massachusetts, and went to meet the sage himself. Now, during one of their meetings, Conway engaged Emerson, and he said, I have to write this essay on the philosophical evidence on the existence of God. And Emerson just stopped him and said, the actual existence of a fly is more important than the possible existence of angels. The actual existence of a fly is more important than the possible existence of angels. Emerson had a great way of kind of just cutting to the chase. Emerson opened up for young Conway the realization that the immanent world, the world we walk in and move in and live in, is glorious, promise-filled, holy, enough. These are some of the promises of our faith, that this glorious, wonder-filled world is enough. That though we don't know what happens in the mystery that lies after our death, we do know that this life is sacred and ours, and that we are given the possibility to honor it and shape it and belong to it. Conway would have learned, studying Channing and meeting other Unitarians, about the value of reason in faith. That we are given the capacity to understand and know, to pass our experiences through the rigorous fire of thought, and to determine ethical and just ways to walk and live and move in this world. He would have heard messages of universalism, that the damnation that so taught him to fear as a child was false, that we are given this boundless love, that each and every person is blessed and forgiven and belonged. We often teach about the interdependent web of life, of which we are all a part, which reminds us how powerful the relationships we have are. The relationships to this earth, to each other, to the sacred, and how those relationships both shape us and have the potential to shape the world for the better. The interdependent web of life reminds us that there are no extra parts, that there's nothing left out, nothing unimportant to the existence of everything else, that each one of us has a radical and profound fact of belonging and mattering. We are taught As Channing used to say, that we are born with the spark of the divine or original blessing, or as we say, with inherent worth and dignity. And because of that, we can be co-creators of goodness and justice. I hope that these are some of the promises of what drew you to Unitarian Universalism, and not just that you could believe whatever you want. And I want to say that too rarely do we really talk about these promises, the beauty of them and the truth of them. How rarely do we hold them up against our lives to have them be tested, questioned, and reaffirmed. Now, Conway thought that the promises were where the story ended. But looking back from when he was 70, at this point in his life, he said, how little I understood about our faith. How little I understood. Because he had not yet gotten to the place of where our promises lead to our purpose. The promises isn't where the story ends. He became the minister of my home congregation, All Souls in D.C. And he was a minister there during the tumultuous years of the 1850s. Each minister essentially had a decision to make. Would they withdraw from those times and begin to preach on individual small morality, abstinence, tolerance, piety? Or would they, as Conway, begin to speak about the urgency of their times? Conway began to choose the second path. As he began to minister with his congregation, he began to realize a few things. That those images of eternal damnation that he had ingrained in him as a child began to fade. But in their place became visible to his open eyes images of a present hell. Images of cruelty and injustice. And he said he went on his knees, committing himself to this most sovereign purpose, to save the hearts of people, the flesh and hearts and blood of people in this world, to help them live the promises of life and fulfillment. He described this great purpose as the world burden. And he knew it came about because his Unitarian beliefs on the immanent of the holy, on the here and the present and the now, led him to look with open eyes at the world and both its promises and its public sins. Conway regularly preached an anti-slavery message from his pulpit. When he considered the weight of this task, of leading a congregation both in the promises of his faith and into this world of burden, his understanding as a minister was always intertwined with the story of this young man who came to his congregation. This man was named Gerald Fitzgerald. I love 19th century names. He came as an 18-year-old. You see, Gerald was raised as a Catholic, but he met a Unitarian girl and converted to be with her. Now, shortly after he joined the church, he fell in love with someone else. I guess we're open-minded. But Gerald Fitzgerald loved Conway's sermons, loved the theology he heard preached, and appreciated the anti-slavery messages. And so, all fired up, he declared and applied to go to Harvard to become a Unitarian minister. Shortly before he left, the Civil War broke out. And Fitzgerald could have gotten out of the Civil War with his connections, but he chose not to because he considered fighting in that war to be a moral cause. Conway wrote that no one ever saw Gerald again. He died by a river with two friends under a tree in an unmarked grave. Years later, Conway would write letters to the young Gerald that he remembered. And he said, "Thank you for all the blessings you brought in my life. I know I put the world of burden on you." The world of burden. You see, this is one of those things about our faith. When you believe that this world is the here and the now, that this is the place that where we find the sacred, that this is the place where justice can reign, that this is the place of wonder and gratitude and surprise, it calls you to a purpose. We don't often talk about how what we think and our calls in the world, how the world calls in the world connect. But I see so clearly this play out. If you believe that only a few are saved and the majority are damned, then you have no problem speaking in judgmental terms about your neighbor. If you believe that heaven on earth, the second coming of Jesus, will only come about after the earth burns and fires spill and wars pour out, then you don't work hard enough to stop those things from happening. If you believe that we are born with sinfulness, then you blame our bodies for almost any act. But in contrast, if you believe that love, unmitigated love and forgiveness is open to all, then you offer forgiveness and mercy and understanding wherever you can. And if you believe that we are born with a goodness inside of us and that our bodies help us experience this wondrous world, then you celebrate. You celebrate sexual intimacy, you celebrate reproduction, you celebrate our bodies and the miracles of life. If you believe that our life on this planet is a gift in this wondrous world, and that this world is the one in which we are meant to live in harmony with humanity within the majesty of our sustainable earth, and you work to protect our earth. I have seen how Unitarian Universalists live into this purpose. When I went to Standing Rock as a chaplain, so interesting to me, there was an Episcopalian priest who put out the call for interfaith chaplains. 7 of the 18 who responded were Unitarian Universalists. When I was in seminary, only 3% of us on campus were Unitarian Universalists, but 50% of those who worked for reproductive justice were Unitarian Universalists. The ones who started conversations on racial reconciliation and accountability were Unitarian Universalists. We surprisingly showed up as a dominant force in worship. We showed up, over 50% of our ministers nationally went to Selma. If you talk to the Black community, if you talk to the LGBTQ community, if you talk to women's rights activists, they'll say, oh, sure, of course, you guys have been here all along. We have a letter of reference to this work because Unitarian Universalists before us have heard these promises and lived into the call of purpose that our theology ignites. My spiritual companions, if you are visiting us today, I think I've spared you from hearing that this is a place where you could believe whatever you want. I think I've been honest with you that there are promises that I think will hold you in this world when you are doubting or afraid. And I have said that this may lead to a life of sacred purpose, with a cost but a glory attached to it. May we go and live out the promises that are given to each of us. Blessed be, and amen, and ashe.